March 1945. A muddy, unpaved field near Weimar, Germany. A diesel engine roars as an American military bulldozer pushes wet earth to carve out a vital supply road. Suddenly, the steel blade grinds to a halt against something solid beneath the mud. The operator shifts into neutral, climbs down, and scrapes away the top layer of dirt with his boot. He spots bone, then white fabric, then a hand. A squad of American engineers moves in with shovels, digging carefully into the cold ground. Within hours, the shallow trench reveals a horrific secret hidden beneath a thin layer of lime and 6 inches of soil. Dozens of bodies appear, stacked on top of each other. The count climbs to 147 dead men and women, executed and discarded just outside a quiet village. General George S. Patton will make the silent locals look at exactly what they tried to bury. This is the story of what Patton did when a bulldozer building a road uncovered 147 bodies buried in a field. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show the moments that forced people to face what they had done. Sergeant First Class Joseph Kowalczyk was 31 years old. He came from a tight-knit Polish-American neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, Illinois. He served in a combat engineer platoon attached to the Third Army. Before the draft pulled him into uniform, Kowalczyk worked in concrete pouring and road building, a quiet man who understood the weight of hard labor. He had watched his younger brother die during the Normandy breakout, a loss that left him hollowed out and completely focused on finishing the job in Europe. He had seen ruined cities and blown bridges across France, but nothing prepared him for the sudden crunch of bone beneath heavy machinery. The moment the bulldozer blade struck that shallow trench, Kowalczyk ordered the engines cut and transitioned his engineering unit into a meticulous forensic detail. Heinrich Brauer was 55 years old. He was the longtime mayor of the small, tidy village situated just 400 meters from the burial field. Brauer wore polished black leather boots, a clean woolen coat, and carried himself with the unearned privilege of a local leader who had maintained order under the party regime. He believed entirely in the survival of his own people at any cost, adhering to the strict hierarchy that dictated obedience to the state above all else. His home featured a spotless kitchen and a well-kept garden, completely untouched by the devastation of the front lines. Brauer kept the local municipal ledger locked in his desk, a book that contained a very specific entry for agricultural lime stamped on the exact date the trench was filled. He had spent the last 8 months walking past that field, looking up at his church steeple, and pretending the earth was empty. By March of 1945, the Allied advance into the heart of Germany was moving at a breakneck pace. The Third Army was smashing through regional defenses, bypassing major strongholds to split the remaining defensive lines. Speed was the only metric that mattered. Because the combat divisions moved so fast, frontline logistics became a nightmare of mud, blown bridges, and ruined infrastructure. Supply routes had to be established over open country, through forests and across farmers' fields to keep fuel and ammunition flowing to the armor spears. In this chaotic environment, military government teams and forward engineers frequently uncovered the hidden remnants of the collapsing regime. Mass graves, makeshift camps, and executed prisoners were being discovered in the woods and valleys of the German countryside almost daily. Many frontline commanders, focused entirely on maintaining the momentum of the advance, simply noted these discoveries on their maps, marked the coordinates for graves registration units, and kept their columns moving forward. There was no time for forensic investigations when the enemy was still retreating ahead of them. The administrative chaos of the occupation meant that dozens of these smaller, localized atrocities were documented in hurried reports and left for regional counterintelligence corps teams to handle weeks later. The assumption was that justice would wait until the fighting stopped entirely. But the rapid penetration of American forces meant that the line between the combat zone and the immediate rear area was completely blurred, bringing frontline combat units face-to-face with civilian complicity before the smoke cleared. The engineering platoon near Weimar, tasked with a routine road construction job, had suddenly stumbled into this exact crossroad of war and systemic murder. Sergeant Kowalczyk walked down the dirt track toward the nearest cluster of brick houses, his boots heavy with the clay of the burial field. He found the village mayor sitting behind a polished oak desk inside the local administrative office, carefully reviewing a stack of agricultural permits. Kowalczyk cleared his throat, holding a stained piece of fabric recovered from the trench. "We found a mass grave 400 meters from your perimeter," the sergeant said. 147 bodies. Mayor Brower did not look up from his paperwork, his fountain pen continuing to scratch against the page. "That has nothing to do with this municipality," Brower said. "Troops pass through here constantly. We know nothing of military movements or operational necessities." Kowalczyk leaned over the desk, placing his muddy hands flat on the clean wood. "Some of them are wearing camp uniforms, but others are in civilian clothes," the sergeant said. "Women are in that pit. They were covered in fresh lime and buried with heavy machinery." The mayor closed his ledger with a deliberate, soft thud, smoothing the front of his pressed woolen coat. "The war is full of unfortunate necessities," Brower said. "It is not the place of local civilians to question the actions of state authorities. We mind our own business, tend our fields, and maintain order. We checked your local supply records in the outer office," Kowalczyk countered, his voice tightening. "Your hardware store sold 300 pounds of agricultural lime on the exact day of the executions." Brower shrugged, his expression completely blank as he leaned back in his leather chair. "Farmers require lime for the soil," the mayor replied. "What happens to commodities after they leave the merchant is completely beyond our control. We are simple citizens. The excavator used to dig the trench belongs to a farm on the northern ridge," Kowalczyk said. "The tracks lead straight from his barn to the burial site. You coordinated the equipment." The mayor stood up, drawing himself to his full height, looking down at the muddy engineer sergeant with cold superiority. "You do not understand how things work here," Brower said. "We were given orders by the district commander. We were told to provide the necessary materials or face immediate execution ourselves. Our duty was to preserve the safety of our own people, not to worry about prisoners who had already been condemned by the state. The ledger is a matter of administrative correctness, nothing more." Kowalczyk stared at the local leader for a long moment, watching the complete lack of remorse in the man's eyes. He turned on his heel without saying another word. He walked straight back to his command jeep and picked up the radio microphone to contact the division headquarters. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-air command jeep pulled up to the brick administrative building. With a screech of tires on the wet gravel, the 4 silver stars on his helmet gleamed against the gray German sky, and the ivory-handled revolvers on his belt caught the dim afternoon light. The general stepped out of the vehicle and walked into the office unannounced, his boots striking the floorboards with a sharp, rhythmic snap. Every man in the room froze. Patton did not raise his voice, but his presence filled the small space instantly. He stopped directly in front of the desk, looking down at the local leader with a cold, piercing gaze. "Are you the mayor of this village?" Patton asked. "I am Heinrich Brower," the mayor replied, keeping his voice steady. "Did you provide the agricultural lime used to cover the bodies in that field?" Patton asked. "I signed the requisition order, because I was commanded to do so by state authorities," Brower answered. "Did you coordinate the farm machinery used to excavate the trench?" Patton asked. "I merely directed the local resources as required under military law," Brower said. "We had no choice in the matter." Patton studied him for a long moment, his face fixed in a mask of absolute stone. "You sit behind a clean desk in a clean coat and speak to me of administrative requirements," Patton said. "You look out your window at a tidy street and pretend the world ends at your municipal border. You tell my officers that you knew nothing of the executions because the orders came from somewhere else, but the earth does not recognize your administrative boundaries. 147 human beings are stacked in a ditch 400 meters from your front door. They were shot through the back of the neck while your people watched from the safety of their homes. Your church steeple looks directly down into that muddy field. The lime that burned their flesh came from your village store. The machine that dug their communal grave came from your neighbor's barn. You knew every shovel of dirt that went into that ground. Sergeant Kowalczyk and his engineers have spent 3 days digging through the clay with their bare hands to pull those victims into the light. My men do not have the luxury of pretending they cannot see the dead. You claim you acted under duress to save your own skin. You chose your comfort over their lives. Now you will choose between a firing squad for complicity in war crimes or face the immediate consequences of what you permitted. Brower looked at the 4 silver stars on Patton's helmet, then down at the ivory revolvers. The mayor's face went completely pale, his hands trembling against the edge of his polished desk as he remained silent. Patton barked the orders directly to his waiting military police officers. Within 30 minutes, the entire civilian population of the nearby village was rounded up from their kitchens, shops, and barns. Armed American soldiers marched the quiet, stone-faced locals down the dirt track toward the muddy perimeter. Patton forced them to stand in a long, single line along the very edge of the open trench, right where the cold wind carried the heavy stench of death and chemical lime across the landscape. The villagers looked down at the 147 bodies laid bare in the clay, staring at the civilian clothing and the stained camp uniforms. Patton ordered a military forensic team to step into the pit with cameras, clipboards, and measuring tapes. Under the watchful eyes of the townspeople, every single body was systematically photographed, measured, and cataloged. Medical officers examined the entry wounds on each skull, calling out the data to clerks who recorded the details in official ledgers. The locals watched in absolute silence as the Americans carefully documented the evidence of the crime they had tried to erase, transforming the anonymous trench into an undeniable crime scene before the war crimes chain of custody took over. Sergeant Joseph Kowalczyk returned to Chicago after the war, carrying the heavy silence of the European theater back to his old neighborhood. He resumed his work in road construction, building highways across Illinois during the post-war boom, though his family noted he could never stand the sight of fresh lime on a job site. He lived a quiet life, rarely speaking to his children about the mass grave near Weimar, and passed away in his home in 1978. Heinrich Brauer was removed from office by the military government and stood trial before a denazification court in 1947, where his administrative ledgers were used as primary evidence of civilian complicity. He served a prison sentence before returning to the village as a social outcast, living in bitter obscurity until his death in 1963. General Patton never mentioned the construction grave in his public statements, but he recorded the event in his personal diary with characteristic gravity. He wrote that the local citizens had tried to bury their conscience under 6 inches of dirt, but the Third Army had forced them to dig it back up with their own hands. Some historians have argued that General Patton's heavy-handed decision to force an entire village population to witness the forensic documentation was an excessive, emotionally driven action that crossed the line from military justice into psychological warfare. They claimed that bypassing established military government protocols and forcing local civilians to stand over a mass grave did little to foster long-term cooperation during the early stages of the occupation. Others argue that his rapid, unyielding intervention was entirely necessary to shatter the widespread systemic wall of local denial that allowed such atrocities to be buried in the first place. What is certain is that Patton's meticulous command to document every individual body preserved critical forensic evidence that would later secure convictions in the post-war courts. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have quietly turned the matter over to the Regional War Crimes Commission without involving the local population? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the moments that forced people to face what they'd done, make sure to subscribe.